recording now. And at the same time, I will mute everybody. So if you have any questions, please unmute yourself and interrupt me. Okay. And today's topic is about China's peaceful rise. We all know that Chinese economy has changed very much in the last 40 years. At the beginning of the PRC in 1949, China is very poor. And then after Deng Xiaoping's reform opening, China started to join the world and industrialize. The industrialization process also involve participating in global trade. As such, by now, depending on what kind of measure, we all know that China's economy is much better than the date when PRC was first formed. If you use the nominal value, China's GDP is about 80% of the largest GDP, that is United States. But you use purchasing parity, then China's GDP has already surpassed USA in April 2014. So China has risen. Of course, if you use per capita, China is still relatively poor. The IMF and the World Bank rate China as the higher bracket of the medium income group. By 2020, China has successfully eliminated extreme poverty. Now, I emphasize extreme because depending on which region in China, there are huge inequality of wealth. For example, in cities like Beijing, Shanghai, then its per capita GDP can match most of the most advanced economy. But in the middle to the Western provinces, then the GDP is much lower. Now, given China has about 4 times the population of United States, so even if China's GDP matches the GDP of United States, is per capita is still only 1/4. So there is still a long way for China to continue development in economy. So that will be another issue. Can China continue to rise? But at the moment, what we are going to do is look back into the last 30, 40 years. And in this look back, we want to concentrate on another term, which is peaceful. Is China's rise peaceful? So there's the question I try to answer today. And then next week and the week follow, I will follow with 2 regions. Next week, we will look at Middle East, and then we will look at the Southeast Asia or Asian countries. Let me move this a little bit. Yep. So the first question is, of course, is China aggressive during this rise? We heard a lot about China threat. The China threat consists of 2 parts. One part is Chinese economy is going to collapse. So the Chinese collapse theory. Another is Chinese threat theory. That means China is a threat to the global system. So we are going to look at this. Is China not following the international order and norms? So we will ask, what is meant, what does it mean by international order and norms? So the first question is, when we talk about aggressiveness, we talk about whether China has initiated any war. The answer is no. Since the formation of the People's Republic of China, China may have involved in two wars. One is the Korean War at the very early stage of the PRC. Another one is the war with Vietnam, although China did support Vietnam against the United States. But in these two wars, in the Korean War, China is supporting the South Korea. And then when the war ends, all the forces, the military forces, retract back to China. China didn't take any territories of the North Korea. For Vietnam, the Chinese forces did get into the land for quite a distance. I think it's over 100 kilometers. But then it quickly withdrew. And the whole entry of forces into Vietnam lasts, I think, less than a month. So other than that, China hasn't involved in any other war. There are a little bit skirmishes between India and China, especially along the border. But these skirmishes are fist fights. Both sides do not use hot weapons. They might use sticks, throw stones against each other, but they never use hot weapon. No bullets was ever fired at the between the Indian and the Chinese, at least for the recent skirmishes we noticed along the China-Indian border. So the next question is, how many military bases did China has outside of China? Well, the answer is one. In Djibouti City. And Djibouti is along the Red Sea. It's one of this very small country. But the interesting thing is, in Djibouti, quite a number of countries have military bases, including the United States. Now, this is the building of the military installment at Djibouti of China. So China have one military space outside of China, and that is for support of the military actions to protect the trade or against the privacy in the Arabian Sea. So I'm going to play you a little video.
I thought the best way to proceed was to get everyone in the one room.
Good thinking.
Okay, you're right. I'll come straight to the point. This white paper is recommending we spend close to $400 billion over the forward estimates. Now, at some point, the PM is going to be asked a very simple question. In order to protect us from which enemy?
It's so hard to say.
400 billion, pick one.
A regional player.
Specifically, Colonel.
An Indo-Pacific regional player.
More specifically?
Indo-Asia Pacific.
That's broader. Who are you leaving out?
Europe?
Yeah, I sort of need a country.
Or an unaligned player.
No, a country. One that won't threaten us. Just one. Yeah.
I wouldn't want to raise tensions.
Where?
In this room.
You know what? I'll name one and you just nod. China. Yeah, okay. And what exactly are we protecting?
Strategic interests.
Specifically, Colonel?
Indo-Pacific strategic
Again,
interests.
really specifically.
Indo-Asia Pacific strategic.
You know what? I'll say it and then you nod. Our trade routes. Yeah. And who is our number one trading partner?
Shall we use the nod system?
Sure. China? Yeah. So under this scenario, we're spending close to $30 billion a year to protect our trade with China from China. And that doesn't strike anyone at this table as odd?
Okay. So a bit a joke. The problem is there's a major player in the world politics which require a permanent enemy. So let's look at a little video between two notable political scientists. John Mearsheimer, an American international politics professor. Another one is Kishore Mahbubani, who has been Singapore's ambassador to the United States for quite some time. And he has been quite active in terms of talking about policy in Asia.
Can China rise peacefully? And the simple answer is yes.
I think the answer is no.
Because one point I emphasize in my book, Has China Won, is that we are entering a new era of world history. 200 years of Western domination of world history is coming to an end, and we're returning to the norm of the first 1800 years, from the year 1 to the year 1820. Two largest economies were always those of China and India. So we're going back to a different world. And remember that when China was dominant, the number one power for most of 1800 years, China didn't conquer the world. China didn't go out like the British, the French, the Dutch, and the Spanish conquering colonies all over the world. Indeed, I believe in the 15th century, they had the largest, most powerful navy under Admiral Cheng He. They went around the world. They didn't conquer any countries. So I think that's a very critical point to bear in mind, with just one minor qualification, and this is important for an Australian audience. As China is rising and returning, it's important that we try to work with China rather than try to provoke China. And that's why managing the rise of China is very critical. The second question is, can China win? And the question is, win what? So clearly, if you mean in terms of can China become the world's largest economy, I can confidently say yes. And all that the Chinese have to do is achieve half the per capita income of the United States, and they will have an economy twice the size of the United States. Simple mathematics. But of course, can China win? Do you mean that China will step in and take over the role of the United States and try and dominate the world? I don't think China wants to do that. And as John Mearsheimer, who's going to speak next, has brilliantly documented in his book, The Great Delusion, America fought a lot of unnecessary wars in the Middle East and elsewhere. This is something that China, I'm reasonably confident, is not interested in doing. It wants to focus on making China a great power, but not take over America's role in terms of managing it.
I have very different views on these two questions than Kishore does. With regard to the question whether China can rise peacefully, I think the answer is no. My basic view is that what China is going to do, as it continues to rise economically is that it's going to translate that economic might into military might, and it's going to try to dominate Asia the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. It's going to try to become a regional hegemon, the way the United States is a regional hegemon here in the Western Hemisphere. My view is that China would be crazy not to try to dominate Asia, because in a world where there is no policeman, no night watchman, it makes eminently good sense for a state to want to completely dominate its region. So I think that China will set out to do that. Of course, the United States does not tolerate peer competitors. The United States wants to remain the only regional hegemon in the world, and it therefore will go to great lengths to prevent China from dominating Asia. And the end result will be that you'll get this intense security competition with a serious chance of war. With regard to the second question, we're very early in this competition, so it is hard to predict who's ultimately going to prevail. I think when you read Kishore's excellent book and you listen to him over the years, he thinks that the Chinese have the wind behind their back and that the United States is kind of like a dinosaur. I would not bet on that, Kishore. If I had to bet, I'd bet on the United States. The United States has taken on 4 potential peer competitors in its history: Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union. The United States played a key role in putting all 4 of those countries on the scrap heap of history. The United States will go to great lengths to compete with China and to prevent it from dominating Asia. And when you look at the demographics of China and the United States, and you look at the economies of the 2 countries, I think that the United States is in better shape than China is. And for that reason, if I had to bet, I'd bet on the United States.
Well, John, thank you so much for that. And as you can tell here, John Mearsheimer and Kishore Mahbubani clearly take different views on this question about whether China can rise peacefully, and whether it's in the process of replacing America in terms of primacy in East Asia.
Okay, so this summarizes the 2 different views. One, obviously, think that as China becomes more open, it will become more like the Western countries. China will adopt the values of the Western thinking, and hence will follow a path of the rise of Western powers. Like we know that in the past, say 300, 400 years, initially we had the Portuguese, and then we had the Spanish, and then of course we have the great British Empire, and today we have the Americans. During all these rises, we see colonization of the world, we see bloodsheds, we see a lot of human sufferings. So the question is, if China continue to rise, will it really adopt the mentality as described by Mearsheimer? Or the Chinese has a different philosophy? And in order to make sure the world doesn't enter into serious conflicts, should we start to understand the rationale behind Chinese rise and try to prevent war as much as we possibly can? Come on, next. Next, come on. Sorry, let me just also move up the navigator, and then here. So let's look at the China threat theory. It has always existed to different degrees. In the 19th century, there are a number of Chinese workers entered into the United States. Actually, we know that there are Chinatown almost in every major city. Take the screen. Okay. So the United States think that as the Chinese migrants settle in China, it might become a threat. So in 1882 and 1884, the U.S. Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. The ideology of white supremacy and the conflict between Eastern and Western civilizations, which are reflected in it, can still be found in the subsequent China theory threats. So at the inception of the Chinese Communist Party in 1900, another surge of the Chinese threat theory comes along, especially when PRC is formally formed in 1949. Then there is a theory that there might be a domino effect. This is a red threat to the United States. That means the Communist Party may, because of the China's formation, spread to Asia, and from Asia spread to the rest of the world, and therefore threaten the Americans' way of life. So there is a red threat theory that's going on since the formation of PRC. And then together with that, after the China opened up, entered into the World Trade Organizations, we started to hear something else. It's the Chinese collapse theory, saying that the rise of China is not sustainable. It cannot continue to rise faster than the West and eventually reach the same level of development at the West. So somehow Chinese will suffer a collapse. So that's one thing. The second part is politically. Chinese political system is different from the election-based multi-party systems in the West. And as China develops, people in China will start to require the government to be diversified, to have multi-parties, and eventually work similar to the Western countries. If the CCP, or the Chinese Communist Party, continues to have a strong hold on the Chinese government, then the government is not stable because the people will require multi-parties, and hence China will collapse. So the Chinese collapse theory contains these two parts. One is economic, the other one is politics. Economically, can China sustain, for example, up to now, 40 years of continuous growth? Secondly, with a single party system, will China's political system collapse? So this is part of the collapse theory. Today, I'm not going to touch upon that. And later on, if the opportunity comes, I will come back to this issue. In the 1990s, as China's economy continues to develop, then the Chinese threat theory becomes entered into the main discourse in the Western media. By 2010, then the issues of the South China Sea started to emerge. So we have to look at what happened in 2010. China entered WTO, the World Trade Organization, in 2001. By 2011, China's economy surpassed Japan, becomes the world's second largest economy, measured by nominal currency values. And from that time onwards, by 2011, Obama came to our parliament and announced that America is returning to Asia. Later on, they said, oh, Americans have always been in Asia, but we focus on Asia. That means Americans realize Chinese economy is now the second largest. It may become a challenger to Americans' dominance in world affairs. So they started taking action. What does it mean by return to Asia? We heard them talk about TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That is on the trade part. At that time, China is already one of the largest trading nations in the world. You guess what? The TPP does not include China. It has all the Asian countries plus South Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand. But around the Pacific, who is the largest trading country? China. Unfortunately, China is not included in TPP. So that everybody can realize what is that implication. The second implication is that the return to Asia objective or strategy will include moving 2/3 of American naval power into the Pacific. So I put that question to you to think in the shoes of the Chinese leaders. Obviously, they know about the TPP. They know about the idea of putting 2/3 of naval power in Pacific. So they look around and ask, what is the purpose of the Americans doing this? Who is their enemy, or at least imaginary enemy? Looking around, the only conclusion, there's nowhere else, is China. So Chinese realize that American is treating China as an enemy. And then, of course, that is also the time when Xi Jinping became the chairman of the Communist Party of China. And they started demonizing the Chinese leader. So again, I'm going to present you another video.
Imagine, it's not completely comparable, but imagine that China was obsessed with arming Hawaii to become an independent state. I wonder how Washington would react to something like that. I'm a PhD in sociology from way back in time at Lund University in South Sweden. So I'm a social scientist, and I've specialized all my academic life on peace studies. That is a branch of social studies where we deal with reducing violence exactly as a doctor reduces diseases if he or she can, and then disseminating this through research, public outreach, and activities on the ground. I worked in a lot of war zones and tried to heal wounds after wars. It's always very difficult to find the reality beneath those types of personal meetings. My quick reading on CNN and BBC and others of what happened yesterday was a benevolent Chinese president who emphasized cooperation, who emphasized that we must solve humanity's problems together, etc. And a Biden who, if he's clear in his brain for some short period, tries to say the same. But then immediately after, he gets a question at the press conference. Do you still think that Xi Jinping, the Chinese president, would you still call him a dictator? Well, I think his formulation is, I spent more than 60 hours with the Chinese president, and yes, I would. And the answer is why? And the question is from Biden, because he runs a communist country that is different from ours. Now, if that's your attitude, if that's your intellectual level, that somebody who runs a country according to different principles is by definition a dictator. I mean, if you think somebody is a dictator, you will treat that person and his country in a different way from if you think he's just a different kind of leader from us, but he's okay. The United States of America and much of the Christian world cannot live without somebody who is different, threatening, non-believers, don't do what we tell them to do, and who do not accept mission. So I believe that that has been sped up, let's say, since the last 5 to 10 years. If I give you an example, I think it's now 5 years ago that the Congress passed a law, and listen carefully, a law which set off $1,500 million, $1.5 billion, over 5 years to train Western journalists in writing negative stories about China. That's done by the state agency of media in the United States. Now, those of us who go to China, or Westerners who live here and see the complexities and the broadness and try to understand China on Chinese premises, see it differently. But that is where they are. They need desperately to have enemies. And if you don't have enemies, and I don't see anything in China's foreign policy that is a threat to the United States. It is not China that has its vessels outside California's coast or Florida's coast. It is the West that has all its vessels around China. And the AUKUS cooperation with Australia, and the submarines that are there, the Germans who are in your waters, the international waters around you too, and the Taiwan issue. I don't see China do these things to the West. Imagine, it's not completely comparable, but imagine that China was obsessed with arming Hawaii to become an independent state. I wonder how Washington would react to something like that. And therefore you invent your enemies. If you want enemies, it's easy to make it. You now have Russia. You have a large part of the African world, the global south. You have China that you declare don't follow us, are different from us, think differently, and therefore they are our enemies. This is very, very dangerous and very, very sad, because we could gain so much from working together. And I can still only hope that there will be somebody who comes to their senses, and it will not be Biden, and it will not be Trump, and change America from the inside. Because the moment America, with all its resources, creativity, and ideas, and history, and knowledge, begin to become a partner in the world, not somebody who insists on dominating over everybody else. The world will be a much better place, and the United States will be a much better place. So I'm looking for a peaceful revolution where the Americans will rise and say, enough is enough with your empire and militarism. We want a good society here, and we want to be friends with the world. The only candidate who is saying that at the moment is Robert Kennedy Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr. But it remains to be seen whether he will have a chance to become a president. I doubt it, but we'll see. Well, if you look at what I would call the social cosmology of the West, it's very much made up of center periphery, one God, one truth, either or thinking, male or female, left or right, not both and it is handicapped by being a culture of mission or missionary. You have the French word civilisation, mission civilisatrice. The idea that we are supposed as number one world, you remember it was one called the first world, the second world, the third world, and the fourth world. That by the first one, there's this idea that we shall all move up to become like the West, Europe and the United States. And that idea, of course, is everywhere, whether in colonialist times in Africa or elsewhere, the liberation movements in the 60s, they said, we don't want to have your system, whether it's Christianity or it's your way of thinking of human rights or whatever. And you have the same question here in China with the opening up of Nixon and Chu Enlai's meeting via the connection of Chas Freeman and Kissinger, that the hope was that if we open up to China, we will achieve two things. One, we will see to it that China and Russia will not be ganging up against us. We'll split you. And secondly, we hope China will go our way, become a multi-party system with a capitalist economy and then be like us. This be like us is over. This be like us or become like us is over. And that's what the Americans cannot understand. They still believe that they have to lead. The world must be led by the Americans. And the reason they can't see it and they are in denial is that it's going down. Not the US as a state or a society, but as an empire. And all empires go down. There's no empire that has existed forever. So you may say the United States today is Titanic. The West is sitting as restaurants in Titanic, and the water is coming up around the windows. Now, instead of then reaching out and say, okay, our time is over, we will be one among many and we will cooperate with you, what they do is they insist on one thing, and that is to dominate by means of deception, untruths, narratives, and secondly, militarism. I would like to predict at this occasion, the United States will go the same way as the Soviet Union because it is militarizing itself to death. The Americans don't do diplomacy anymore. They send weapons. They pour in weapons because that's what they are best at. But no country can survive with just being strong in one sense, for instance, militarily. If you become politically weak, you become economically weak, you become psychologically weak, you become weak in terms of international law and legitimacy, then you are on your way down. A strong country is one which has high level on all power indicators and do not over-militarize and neglect the other power scales. The United States has, you can say, a MIMAC, military, industrial, media, academic complex. These are elites who have common interests with each other, such as producing weapons, selling weapons, using weapons, destroying countries, rebuilding countries again. But they do not have any common interest with the people in their countries. They're outside democratic control, and who said that? President Dwight D. Eisenhower in 1961 or 2, or whenever he made his farewell speech. It's a very famous speech by a man who was a general himself, who said the United States has developed a military industrial complex. He didn't call it MIMAC as I do. And we need to put it under control to remain a democracy. What is undermined very, very clearly now is pluralist open media and our democracy in the West, because everything is now geared to warfare and militarism. More, more, more. There's nobody who stops to think. There's nobody who stops to think about the long-term consequences of pouring in weapons and never solving the conflicts. You just look at what goes on now in Israel. The country that has so much weaponry already, had nuclear weapons, have had a special agreement with weapons with the United States, $5 billion a year, I don't know for how many years. What is the first reaction in Washington? We must transfer even more weapons to Israel. This is a sick society. It's a sick way of thinking. And of course, this whole thing has to do with, as I said before, the dream, the unrealistic dream or illusion that if we can get rid of Russia as an opponent, and we have created that opponent ourselves because they have never invaded a NATO country, they hope that they can concentrate all NATO's resources on a Cold War or, God forbid, a hot war against China. You just go to NATO's homepage and you look at the threat perception. NATO is now characterized to be something like a church. You either believe in this nonsense or you don't. There's never an argument on NATO's homepage. The text is, China is a threat or a challenge because China is different from us. China has different interests from us in the West. Now, if that's how you define a threat, everybody around the world basically is a threat. So the whole thing is a military-industrial complex lives from finding enemies, because if you don't have enemies or say you have enemies or appoint somebody or make enemies, you can't legitimate your own arms development, and the military-industrial media academic complex will fall apart. So that's why the moment we get rid of that military-industrial media academic complex, we can begin to talk to each other as human beings. So the long story short here, I think, is that I wouldn't trust that the Americans are going to change much unless there is a people's revolution, a non-violent, not a stupid thing that we saw on 6th of January 2 years ago. But if there is an uprising in the United States saying, no more militarism, we want a good society here, we want cooperation with China and everybody else in the world. We need to cooperate to solve humanity's environmental problems, poverty problems, infrastructure problems, all these things. We're wasting every hour for humanity's and our children's future by militarism and warfare. Now, I know that China is the second largest military power on earth and has nuclear weapons. I have a problem with that, but that's my problem. But the long story short is that China wants cooperation. It wants the Belt and Road Initiative. It wants a good relationship with the US. It maybe do things we don't like in the West, but it's not a reason to have a Cold War against it. It's a reason to talk with it. So therefore, these meetings are important, but we need much more dialogue in terms of online thinking. We need NGOs working together. We need cultural people working together. In parentheses, I'm also an art photographer and I'm trying to do an exhibition here in China about dialogue. And those types of things that can soften the hardliners, undermine the hardliners who want sooner or later a war. And if you ask me, Taiwan, it's very simple. It's China. It's China, and it's very clear in the communique between Zhou Enlai and Nixon. I think it's number 12. It's a very large document, very clearly saying the United States will not interfere in this issue. And so we have a one China policy. It does all the things it shouldn't do in Taiwan. And I have a huge problem with that. I'm not very popular saying that in the West. But if we keep on doing this, we can only hope that China will be patient enough for long enough for the United States to sink on its own in that destructive self-militarization. But I would wish, as somebody who has never hated the US and never been anti-US, or anti-American, as they say. I'm a collector of American art. I work with American scholars every day. That the United States will come to its senses and begin to see itself as one partner of the world and not a dominator, an imperialist and militarist. I think it's possible. We still have this possibility of rising from below in the Western world and say enough is enough. I'm looking for democracy to work that way. I'm not looking for Biden or Trump. I don't think they will change the system. We need a system change in the West. Well, there can't be peace in the world without the two biggest countries and economies working together. Again, I would have hoped that the European Union would be helpful. The European Union could have been a mediator in a way between Americans' hardline anti-China policies and China. But with von der Leyen obviously being more or less, a propagator of Washington, having no independent mind or thinking of the European Union, and with Mr. Borrell, who's basically a racist. Remember his statement about paradise in Europe and the jungle outside that is dangerous. There's not much hope there either. I was a believer in the European Union because I thought it could be another West with a more intelligent dialogue policies, East, West, North, and South, than the empire over there were in Washington was. But I was wrong. So I'm not very optimistic on the short run. In the long run, I'm optimistic because the day the US empire has fallen, NATO will fall apart. There's no NATO without the US leadership and militarism. And that's a moment when we could create a multipolar, peaceful, cooperative world. I hope I live long enough to see that materialize.
Okay, so understanding China, I think, is the only way forward. If we stuck with our Western values and Western thinking and the missionary concept of everybody else should be like us, then there will not be peace. Moving on, we have this here, a Singapore politicians who himself is a Chinese native, ethnic Chinese. So he understands Chinese culture much better than many of us here. So let's hear what he had to say.
So what does the U.S. get wrong about China, and how would you advise them to think about China?
The U.S. political system is decentralized, and because of the need to win votes, it goes through emotional phases, and it's entering such a phase now where China is demonized out of mass emotion. There's some manipulation behind the scenes, but it's not based on knowledge. You ask those who are anti-China, where's Luoyang? Where's Singapore? They won't be able to tell you, but they have strong emotions. They know everything about Tibet, know everything about Xinjiang. But really, so it's not sustainable, and they don't understand the nature of China. Why is China always building walls around itself? Every dynasty rebuilds the Great Wall. And even today, capital markets, Hollywood movies, COVID, China is constantly building walls around itself because it is happy in its own homogeneity. It has a very different nature from America. But the Americans think that China wants to displace them as top dog in the world. And because of that, it's trying to contain China, even pull it down, if possible. And my fear is it may exhaust itself in the process, and I don't think it will succeed. You take this latest move to impose 100% tax on EVs. I mean, the Qing dynasty did that right in the 19th century. And the result was the world passed it by. And within a few decades, its position plummeted in the world. That's the danger of shutting out the world. The Europeans can't do it, not the Germans. So they said, no, we will rise to the challenge of China. And whether it's Mercedes-Benz or BMW, these are very solid organizations. And I think they will put up a stiff resistance and in some ways will remain better than the Chinese. But if you say, no, hide behind the walls, 100% tariff, you become very weak. But this is the phase Americans are going through. But I fear that on multiple fronts now, they are facing very difficult challenges. You look at, well, the Democrats are more globalists. I mean, they They express American exceptionalism. They feel that America should be dominant everywhere and its values should prevail everywhere. I don't think they can succeed. Trump is more isolationist. He tells NATO partners, if you don't cough up, it's like your insurance. If you don't pay your premium, the policy is cancelled. NATO won't defend you. People are in shock when he talks like that. But does it make sense? In a way, he does. Because if I am an ordinary American, who's paying for all this? Well, you can print the US dollar, that's okay. But one day you cannot just print dollar like that. And it'll be a choice between guns and butter. So my money goes to guns or for my butter. There's no question how they will vote. So the key event will be when the primacy of the US dollar breaks. We all know you have to break sometime or other because it's abnormal. If it's 30 years from now, well, let's drink and be merry. But if it's 5 years, well, we've got to calculate, right? Do we know when the cookie will crumble? We don't know. But the way the US is moving is bringing forward that day. I mean, they try to control countries by sanctions. And if you are subject to sanctions, it's no joke. I mean, I have Hong Kong friends. One of them is quite senior in the administration. They say, no, I'm completely beholden to my wife. I can't have a credit card, I don't have a bank account. All my assets are with her, I better be nice to her. So if you're under sanctions, it's no joke. So when they threaten the ICC, you put out an arrest warrant on Netanyahu, will go after you and your family members. A number of US senators have signed them. So of course the ICC has to stand up to it. But I'm quite sure privately, they'll say, this is a serious matter. Not just me, but also my entire family. Then how do I operate? But how long can you pursue this cause? So last night, India, yesterday, India signed an agreement with Iran to open up a new corridor from Chabahar to the Caspian to Central Asia. Now, Chabahar was used by the Indians to supply the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan. With US support, they closed one eye. But now the US have moved out from Afghanistan, India is left without a capability in Asia. So strategically, they need access. And the US said, we will sanction you. I don't think the US can afford to sanction India because they wanted India to side with them against China. The Indians know it. The Indians are playing a very clever game. They say, well, we're buying arms from Russia, we're selling arms to Russia, we'll have access to Iran, and do your worst. I don't think the US were there to do its worst. And everywhere now, the US will find countries standing up to them. So you can no longer contain Iran. You can't contain North Korea with Russia as a member of the Security Council refusing to vote to continue the surveillance facility on North Korea. So this is the kind of situation we're entering. And it's a bit strange. Last night, I do not know whether you read your report this morning. Blinken was in Kiev. And he went to an underground bar, literally underground bar, to strum the guitar and sing Neil Young's Living the Free World. And it's all over the internet now. Why did he do that? I mean, there's a war going on around him, That's very strange. Something is happening. So we better be very alert. We're entering a great transition. US, China is part of it. India is part of it. Middle East is part of it. Ukraine and Gaza are certainly a part of it. And one way or another, it will affect us in Southeast Asia. There's information warfare against China. Yes, China faces a lot of problems. They punctured the real estate sector. It will take them years to sort it out, but they put a bottom to it because it's on everybody's balance sheet and they can't afford for it to implode. I think the real estate sector in China has bottomed out. I mean, there'll still be scares here and there, but by and large, it's bottomed out. But it will not go back to the go-go years of the past, not for many years, if ever. Is China in trouble? I don't think so. I mean, look at the factories, look at the EVs, look at how terrified the Europeans are, accusing China of having overcapacity. I mean, how can you blame China for overcapacity when you're taking liberties with yourself, having long summers and working short hours? And you say, no, you are working too hard. There are consequences. And if families take liberties with their children or with themselves, there are consequences. So if you look at Asia, look at China, look at Southeast Asia, look at India. There are people who are hardworking, who obsess over their children, who want to have of them a higher education, who will scream in order that the kids will have a better education, better health, better life. In the end, the governments will sort themselves out and they'll do well. And we're lucky to be in the part of the world where strange values have not taken over societies. I mean, let's ask ourselves, 19th century, Qing Dynasty China, the opium problem. I mean, of course, it is the evil of the West, selling opium to China. But why was there a market? Why was there a market that insisted on opium to drug pain and suffering? Why is America such a big market for drugs today? And I was watching the Eurovision contest in clips of it. I mean, the big issue was how the Israeli contestant was being booed and so on. It's very unfair to her, but I mean, there's politics. But parts of it, almost satanic. But it's now part of the fashion, the morals of Europe. What's happening? PM Lee talked about how we should keep all these woke things away from us as much as possible. I fully agree with him. Keep our societies wholesome. Keep our families intact. I mean, AI is very important, but AI cannot answer moral questions for us. In the end, it's every individual, every child who must make the choice. Be immersed in technology, make use of it, but have our own sense of what it means to be a human being. So if we use that as a template to judge human society, I say we're very lucky to be in a part of the world where societies by and large are wholesome and will do well. But of course, if there's war, then everything gets upset. So there must be an overriding desire and mission to keep the peace in the region, to keep conflicts within bounds. I think ASEAN will be okay. ASEAN is not held together by love, it is held together by fear. Because even if you're Indonesia, you know that others are much bigger. And if we don't stick together, we'll be balkanized. And instead of becoming neighbors, we become clients of big powers. Instead of using them, they make use of us. That's always the threat. It's like the Philippines now. The Philippines have legitimate disputes with China. Both sides have their cases. The Americans see an opportunity there and jump in, to bring in the Japanese. And now Philippine politics is caught up in this. Can accident happen? Yes. Will it lead to war? I doubt it. Because in the end, interests will assert themselves. And the business community in the Philippines, which has a strong Chinese component, they don't like what they're seeing. And below the emotions, the Filipinos know that in the end, they need economic development. And to some extent, if the Americans are somewhere, they strengthen their negotiating position with China. So China must manage this skillfully understanding the domestic politics, understanding that deep inside, the Filipinos are pro-American. I remember when the Filipinos asked Americans to leave Clark and Subic base, they said, GI, go home, but bring me along with you. So this is the Philippines as it is. So China must work with it and find a way to save face. I mean, they had an agreement, a gentleman's agreement with Duterte, which Marcos has repudiated. So, okay, so they must find a new way to equilibrate and make use of the Americans and not be made use of by the Americans. But that's very difficult. When you try to make use of a big power, you end up being made use of by them. So Singapore has learned that lesson. We are very careful. Then look at Vietnam. Vietnam has made a very important decision to go with China. It was not well reported, but Vietnam has agreed that Hanoi will be linked to Kunming and Nanning by high-speed rail. This is big because each connection is tens of billions of dollars and will change the topological configuration of logistics and supply chain and human movement for decades to come. The Vietnamese held back this decision for a long time, but they're cracking down on corruption. China is now an inspiration to the General Secretary, but he's having one hell of a fight in Vietnam. But I think in the end, they have no choice. Because if the Communist Party is termite-ridden, there's no hope for Vietnam. They know it. And they didn't fight the French and Americans, nothing. And just this month, just maybe today, I think, they're celebrating the 70th anniversary of the victory over the French in Dien Bien Phu. Generations died to secure the independence. They are not going to throw it all away by allowing corrupt officials to take over the country. And they're watching China and the way it's going. So they will take the same route. Indonesia, Prabowo, first visit to China. People scratch their heads. Why did he do that? And when he met Xi Jinping, it was Xiao Ti talking to Daka, little brother talking to big brother. But when he went to Japan, then his brother talking to brother. But don't be mistaken, because Southeast Asians have seen China in early incarnations. They know the Chinese like all these things. So when they go to China, they will bow and they will scrape and so on. But it doesn't mean that they are servile inside. And if interests are involved, they will assert themselves, as we see in the Philippines. But it's part of Li, it's part of the ritual of relations with China. And look at the other countries, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, Brunei. No one wants China to be an enemy. And the Americans don't understand this yet. That because China is getting bigger and bigger for us, all of us want the Americans to be in the room. But if the Americans say, no, we have to choose between China and us, then we say, no, we can't. How can we choose? I mean, China is where our the bread is buttered, But if they don't ask us to choose, then every door, every window is open to the Americans. And they will not have to pay a cent. I think eventually they will come to this realization. The Europeans and Japanese already know it. But it will take time. And this is a transition that unfortunately we have to go through.
Okay, so we have heard different speakers. First of all, from a contrasting view, whether China can continue, and then gradually talk about the reality of the current geopolitics. So the next issue is China continues to rise? Will it face an economic collapse?
China has not been having a good year,
Between extended lockdowns, real estate market collapses, banking crises, trade wars, food insecurity, and an unusually high level of civil unrest, it's starting to look like the once invincible CCP is forming cracks. Look, I know it's fun to speculate the demise of a regime that has done some terrible things, but now is probably the time to remember that just because we want something to be true doesn't mean that it is. It's easy to see why news stories, articles, and so many YouTube videos speculating about how many days left until China collapses is getting so much attention. But if you hadn't guessed already, it's probably not going to happen. At least not in X number of days. We also shouldn't be hoping for it to happen. As cathartic as the idea of our biggest global rival imploding might be, we also have to realise that this would be good news to nobody. And I'm not just talking about the 1.5 billion mostly innocent people living their lives and raising their families in China. I'm also talking about all of us that depend on a delicate global finance and trade system which would not react well to the second largest player falling into disarray. To make sense of these, frankly, very clickbaity titles, we must as always understand a few important things. So, why is everyone suddenly predicting that China is on the brink of collapse? What are the chances that these predictions will actually come true? And finally, why is this most likely totally overblown? This episode of Economics Explained was brought to you by Brilliant, the best online tool to teach yourself science, technology, engineering, and math. I think there is a big difference between just learning something and truly understanding something. I could tell you that a launched object will fly through the air in the shape of a parabola, and you could repeat that factoid back to me, so I guess you would have technically learnt it. But would you remember it, and would you understand why? Would you be able to tell me what would happen if we changed any of the variables in our perfect model? If instead you understood the interplay of forces acting on that object, you could tell me what shape it would make as it flew through the air, and you could also tell me what would happen if we launched the object in space, or underwater, or without gravity. That is understanding, and you will remember things that you understand for a lot longer than things that you merely learnt. Brilliant's interactive courses are structured in such a way as to make sure that you are understanding the subject as you go. To get started for free, go to brilliant.org/economicsexplained, or click the link in the description below, and the first 200 of you will get 20% off Brilliant's annual premium subscription. Now, before I get into China's apparent collapse, I want to do two things. The first is to give the standard big disclaimer that internal Chinese economic figures are extremely unreliable and in multiple instances have been found to be altered by authorities to present the nation's economic situation in a more positive light. The other thing I want to mention is that while I was researching and writing this video, I noticed that another smaller economics YouTuber by the name of Money and Macro made a very similar video. For the most part, we have explored completely separate issues within the bigger theme of this collapse narrative, but I want to mention his work anyway because he is great at calling out journalists and YouTubers on their nonsense, including myself in the past, although I think I got the last laugh on that inflation situation. Alright, now that that's out of the way, China's economy has not been having a very good time recently for a laundry list of reasons that I think are worth addressing individually. Most recently, it has had record heat waves and droughts. Heat waves in any country are bad news, but China is uniquely unprepared to deal with them. Most of their industrial capacity comes from city centres, which have effectively had to shut down due to extreme heat causing conditions that make it difficult to go outside, let alone perform physical work in the nation's factories. Droughts are also bad news for the economy. Now, the situation on the ground is probably not as bad as people are saying. Nobody is going to run out of drinking water. People don't drink municipal water in China anyway. But water supply issues are going to have real impacts in other areas. Industry in China is heavily concentrated along its rivers, primarily the Yangtze, which is a waterway that has 175 cities built along its banks. If the Yangtze River was a sovereign nation, it would be the third largest economy in the world after the United States and, of course, China itself. The river is running dry along certain crucial sectors, which is directly interfering with hydroelectric power stations, regular power stations that need the water for cooling, internal shipping up and down the waterway, waste management as sewage and industrial runoff becomes more concentrated, and of course, farming. China is a very arable country with a lot of productive farmland, but it also has a lot of mouths to feed. As a country, it still relies on food imports to feed its large population. International food markets have seen the price of staples like grains, rice, and proteins skyrocket in the wake of agricultural slowdowns, general inflation, as well as the war taking place between Russia and Ukraine, two of the top 10 largest wheat-producing nations in the world. In a cruel twist of irony, China was already struggling with food production this year because of flooding. Now again, I want to emphasize that the population isn't likely to starve in China because of these food shortages, at least not for the next 27 days or whatever. But feeding families is going to become a lot more expensive, especially for cultural staples like pork, which is actually where a good portion of grain production in China ends up. It's important to remember that while Chinese citizens are much richer than they were even a decade ago, it's still a very poor country by Western standards, with the average urban worker earning just $14,000 per year and rural farmers earning far less than that. If you are the majority of my audience from an advanced economy and have been struggling with food prices yourself, just imagine how difficult it is for a population with significantly less disposable income. There is an old saying that a society is just 3 missed meals away from total collapse, and perhaps we are starting to see a toned-down version of this already. Again, nobody is starving, but when people have to start making decisions and sacrifices to feed their families, unprecedented civil unrest is easy to sympathise with. Now, if food and water shortages weren't enough, there is also the ongoing issue with housing and jobs. I first made a video on China's debt crisis a little over a year ago. Since then, things have only become worse. There were, of course, the issues with Chinese property developers that threatened to leave millions of people without their properties that they'd already paid for. And while the government has thus far managed to contain that issue, it's not changing the fact that China's biggest industry is built on pillars of sand. It's very easy to grow an economy through a combination of low-cost manufacturing, government stimulus through infrastructure, and building houses to supply an ever more speculative market. The problem is that while this strategy might be extremely effective in the short term, it's unsustainable in the long term. Trying to grow an economy by exploiting these 3 factors is like trying to become an athlete by giving yourself an IV drip of 5-hour energy. You might very well break the 100-meter dash world record, but your heart is probably going to explode before you finish a marathon. Very simply, low-cost manufacturing in China has made the country lots of money. The Chinese population is still not rich by Western standards, but their incomes are many multiples of what they were even a decade ago. This means that their cost competitiveness is not as strong as it once was, and manufacturers are now looking to other options like Vietnam, India, Indonesia, and even America. Obviously, American factory workers demand much higher wages than Chinese factory workers, but shipping has been extremely expensive recently. In July of 2021, it cost around $2,500 to send a 40-foot shipping container from Shanghai to Los Angeles. In July of this year, that price was $20,000. The average factory worker is going to produce more than 2 shipping containers worth of product every year, which means that even if American companies have to pay their workers $35,000 a year more, they would still come out ahead. They would be saving money while also having the benefit of shorter and less complicated supply lines and being able to say that their product is made in America. In the past, the middle income trap, as this phenomenon is known, has been dismissed in China's case because low labour costs were just a small part of what made Chinese manufacturing so competitive. The country had also benefited from lax laws around environmental impacts, cheap shipping for massive economies of scale, a relatively skilled workforce, low standards for working conditions, and technical agglomeration. Technical agglomeration is the benefit that businesses get from being close to other businesses in the same industry. If suppliers, workers, consultants, customers, and even competitors are very close together, then it encourages the sharing of components, skills, ideas, feedback, and competition, respectively. Cities like Shanghai, Shenzhen, Chongqing, and Guangzhou all benefit greatly from being bustling hubs of business activity, or at least they did. But the trade wars, extended lockdowns, and heat waves we explored earlier are all putting a massive damper on this business activity, which has the potential to snowball rapidly because the benefits of agglomeration require a critical mass of activity. As soon as some business dries up, the rest quickly follow. But maybe I've made the same mistake that a lot of economists do when they are assessing China's economy, which is to assume that they are still an economy directly dependent on mercantilist trade performance. While exports are obviously still a very large part of China's economy, it also has a domestic market, which, like most economies, accounts for a majority of its output. The problem it's facing here, though, is that a large portion of that output has come in the form of housing and infrastructure. Infrastructure spending is a great way to stimulate an economy. To build roads, railways, bridges, and all of the stuff that China's been building en masse in the past 3 decades, you need to employ a lot of people and spend a lot of money. This gives money directly to workers and businesses in the same way as direct stimulus like tax breaks or stimulus checks. But it also has the added benefit of creating something that will continue to add value to the economy for years and decades to come. Sounds great, but if you have already watched my video on China's $850 billion trains to nowhere, you'll know that you can't do this endlessly. Effective stimulus has to be performed to counter the cyclical boom and bust nature of economies. Governments should apply stimulus when an economy is facing a downturn, and they should ease up or even reverse stimulus efforts when an economy is going very well. China has basically been putting the infrastructure stimulus accelerator to the floor for the past 2 decades and has been pushing harder still since the GFC. This has meant that they have been able to build a lot of impressive things and make a lot of impressive headlines, but they've been doing it all while spending a lot of money during a time when they really didn't need to be. They have also now run out of things to build. Almost every possible piece of infrastructure that made sense to build in China has already been built. That means that now the government has been forced to rip up and redo perfectly good projects or build stuff in areas that don't really need it. You have all probably heard about China's ghost cities, developments with thousands of apartments but nobody living in them. Well, all of those ghost cities have ghost road networks, ghost utilities, and ghost public services too. Worse than simply providing no benefit, this infrastructure is an ongoing liability because it needs to be maintained, and in many cases, it was funded through municipal borrowing. A big motivating factor of China's Belt and Road Initiative is that it could continue its infrastructure spending in areas that would actually genuinely benefit from it. China invested heavily into developing nations in Southeast Asia and Africa by giving big loans from state-owned banks to smaller governments to fund the construction of ports, railroads, and other trading-focused capital. Of the 54 countries in Africa, 49 have infrastructure loans from China. The loans were generally given on the condition that construction would be done largely or exclusively by Chinese companies using Chinese workers so that the Chinese economy would still benefit from the stimulating effects of government expenditure. Of course, if China builds a port in Africa, it does not benefit from the added efficiency that that port provides to the economy, apart from opening up a new trading partner, which isn't insignificant, but it is still not as good as building a much-needed port in their own country if their country had a need for any ports. By investing in infrastructure in foreign countries, though, the Chinese government substitutes domestic market efficiency for a stream of income in the form of loan repayments. This means that it gets to put money into the pockets of its workers while getting itself a new trading partner and spreading its economic influence, all without actually needing to spend any money in the long term because it will all be repaid to them. Except that it hasn't been. China has had to forgive a huge amount of these loans because the governments that they loaned the money to were unwilling or in most cases unable to pay them back. This can be for a number of reasons. At the end of the day, most African economies are very small and unstable, but in a lot of cases, these defaults are coming as the result of the infrastructure spending not providing the benefits it was promised to, either because it was poorly planned, poorly constructed, or never finished. In fairness, China has been generous with these loan forgiveness initiatives, but that has normally come on the proviso that the indebted nations fall in line with support for China on its more controversial international ambitions. Now, unpaid loans lead us nicely onto housing. China is heavily overexposed to real estate. In the US, housing contributes about 15 to 18% to the country's total output. That's everything from new home construction to renovations, landscaping, and even real estate agent commissions on sales. At even a 15% rate, America is arguably already overexposed to this highly speculative industry, but in China, that number is 30%. 30% of China's output, a large portion of its growth over the past decades, have been fueled by housing. That's because, like infrastructure, housing is a really easy way to boost employment and household spending. Construction always requires a large amount of labour, and people treat spending on new homes very differently than they would spending on regular consumer items. Households in China have been willing to take on astronomical amounts of debt to buy apartments in poorly constructed buildings on top of land that belongs to the government. So far, this system has been a win-win-win for all participants involved. Investors have seen the price of their homes skyrocket off the back of endless debt-fueled speculation. Banks have been able to write huge loans to an industry that most believe the government wouldn't let fail. Provincial governments made lots of money by selling land use rights to developers. The developers made lots of money by building cheap houses that they could sell for astronomical prices. And the national government was happy because this merry-go-round of greed was great for employment and growth figures. But like all feedback loops, this was bound to end in disaster, and it has been. We have already made multiple other videos covering housing, debt, and government taxation in China before, so I don't want to repeat too much here. But I do want to highlight that the collapse of this market is creating a panic that banks will not be able to honor withdrawals since they too are so heavily invested into the real estate market. Chinese citizens are now facing what was once unthinkable, which is that their homes, which represent their investments, savings, retirement plannings, and their housing all in one, are now borderline unsellable, and that's if they're lucky enough to actually have a house. Developers are unable to finish projects that people have already paid for, more often than not with a combination of their own savings and a mortgage. Those people who are unlikely to get their houses are now refusing to pay their mortgages, which means banks are running out of cash even faster than they were before. In anticipation of cash shortages, people are going to withdraw their savings from at-risk institutions, which is only further accelerating the problem. This is a classic run on the banks, and most economists see this as basically financial Armageddon. So there we are. A housing market collapse at least twice as potent as the GFC, municipal bankruptcies, foreign investment breakdowns, failing infrastructure, trade wars, droughts, flooding, heat waves, extended lockdowns, food shortages, civil unrest, industrial slowdowns, and bank runs. That's the brief list of things going wrong in China right now. This is to say nothing of an aging population, a long-term loss of industrial competitive advantage, and the gradual decline towards a less business-friendly, more authoritarian government. We can ignore those factors for now because, again, we are just trying to work out if China's going to collapse in the next 27 days or whatever. But with all of this going on at the same time, maybe it's more efficient to ask why China won't collapse. Now, to explain this, we first have to define what a collapse is. If we are defining a collapse as the total breakdown of civil order, people marching in the streets, governments being deposed, something like the Arab Spring, in many ways, there are some similarities. Those uprisings were kicked off by stagnating economic growth in Tunisia, and they were directed at authoritarian governments that were impeding on people's liberties. So it could very well collapse in the same way that America could have collapsed during the GFC, or in the same way that anything could theoretically happen at any time. If government leadership gets backed into a corner and tries to do something like invade Taiwan, then yes, it's going to collapse and it will very quickly turn into a failed state. It's just extremely unlikely. We as economists also don't know what we don't know. There could be anything from further natural disasters to government infighting to an alien invasion that could cause the state to collapse. But that's not a situation unique to China. It's just that China is in a slightly more precarious situation at the moment. If I had to present a scenario probability report, this would be a 1% chance, where a regular economy might be a 0.5% chance, and something like Russia would be 25%. Another potential collapse situation wouldn't so much be a collapse in the traditional sense as a regression towards becoming a closed-off, centrally planned economy again. We can in many ways already see this playing out. The country is becoming much more strict about who leaves and who enters. It has undeniably taken on a more nationalistic persona, and it's aligning itself with countries who are themselves getting cut off from the rest of the world. Now, I would argue that if this does happen, it will continue to be a very slow, very gradual decline rather than a collapse in the sense that China wakes up one day and realizes that it's North Korea 2.0. It would also be much harder to pull off. One of the reasons having a wealthy population is so fantastic is that they have the capacity to be politically active. China's population, while still not wealthy by Western standards, is not living meal to meal like it was back when the country was closed off from the outside world. It's much harder to subjugate a population that has tasted wealth and freedom. Not impossible, but much harder. All right, now I've covered myself from the "this didn't age well" comments. In the event that this whole situation actually does go south, it's probably better to look at some more realistic reasons why it probably won't. The first is that China can afford some economic setbacks. It has been home to the most intense period of economic growth in history. It has gone from a mostly agrarian backwater to the second largest economy in the world in the span of someone's working career. Lots of other countries have economic setbacks, and it's not too often that we see these devolve into outright revolution or anything of that nature. What's more is that a bit of an economic slowdown might be exactly what the country needs. Modern economies run on the business cycle. This is a rough pattern of booms and busts with a frequency of around a decade. This pattern is mostly caused by debt. When on average people are taking on debt, the economy does really well. And then when on average people are paying off or defaulting on their debt, the economy slows down a bit. Now, while those slowdowns might be painful, if well managed, they play a really important role in the long-term health of an economy. Downturns weed out underperforming businesses, products, and employees as everybody is forced to cut down to the essentials, which means that only the most competitive, value-adding, and efficient entities survive. I understand on a human level that sounds terrible, but long-term it means that the economy can bounce back stronger, which is a big part of the reason why, on average, this cycle of booms and busts tends to trend upwards over time. A pullback in the Chinese economy, again, if managed properly, could be a huge opportunity for the economy to shift away from its overdependence on real estate and infrastructure and focus more on value-adding industries like high-tech manufacturing, research and development, tourism, and finance. The Chinese economy is also a lot more robust than most economists are giving it credit for. This might be confusing, especially since I said a lot of the biggest industries are built on very shaky foundations, but these two factors are not mutually exclusive. Its real estate and infrastructure industries are crumbling, literally and figuratively, but the Chinese government is more than capable of controlling the damage from these issues in the short term. China has the most foreign currency reserves of any nation in the world by a huge margin. This means that in a worst-case scenario, it could completely hold off bank runs just by printing more money and dispersing it through a series of state-owned banks. Normally, this would cause inflation, but China can afford that right now. One positive side effect of all of this consumer hesitancy is that China is not having the same problem with inflation that a lot of other countries in the West are. The Chinese central bank has actually bucked the global trend and is lowering interest rates at the moment in the hopes of offsetting some of the pain caused by the collapse of the housing market. It can further prevent this having any knock-on effects by using its foreign currency reserves to protect the value of its currency so that it doesn't end up like Turkey or Venezuela. It turns out having a $3.4 trillion pile of money is also very effective in shoring up food security as well. China already imports more food than it exports, and if it needs to spend a little bit of extra money on making sure that its citizens are fed, it's going to be more than happy to do so, knowing the alternative. There are also the non-economic factors. Of course, this is outside of my specific area of expertise, but the Chinese population does not have the same opportunity for regime-changing levels of civil unrest. The government is authoritarian and they monitor everybody very closely. People will no doubt voice their frustrations, especially if they're in a situation where they are not going to get a house that they've paid for. But these protests are not directed at the government or the country. If anything, they are a very public way for these people to ask their government to bail them out of a situation that they have found themselves in. Chances are the government probably will bail them out too. People are happy to give up a lot of liberties if it means they are getting rich. But in many cases, entire families have pooled their life savings of multiple generations to afford modest homes that won't be delivered. The government is likely to do what it does best and invest into building projects to soften the blow of this economic downturn. Only now, instead of building roads to nowhere, it has the opportunity to build something that really is in demand, and that is the housing that people have already paid for. It's another win-win. It will provide economic stimulus at a time when the country actually needs it, and it will avoid a situation where tens of millions of people have nothing to lose. The kinds of situations that tend to get a bit revolutionary.
Okay, I will stop it here because time is running out. But I will still have a number of videos to show you, at least 2. That means I will continue this next week. And there is a lot of views coming from the last video I showed you. And I think there are some major understanding issues, which this particular video has made, because macroeconomics is very different from microeconomics. And I will try to address this issue maybe in the third meeting of this term. Next time, I will be focusing more on Middle East. We all know that at the moment, Middle East is at the brink of a major war. I think we all hope that it won't happen, but the chances of it happening is really, really high. So I will leave the other videos for next time, and then we'll have a discussion next time, because we don't have the time to afford this time. So thank you for attending, and we will continue next week. Goodbye. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Albert.
You're welcome. Thank you. Bye-bye.